So Europe and the European people are the evil ones who colonized the entire planet and genocided, subdued all these poor Africans and poor American natives. But is that really true? As I see it nowadays, you know, I grew up with this notion, and I was always kind of a patriot for the Native Americans. You know, I was like an Inca patriot. I wanted to go to Peru and learn the Inca language, and you know, I felt always sad about the disappearance of the Native American cultures. I thought that a great treasure had been lost for the world when all these cultures declined and died out. Now, I was always kind of convinced that it is the Spanish people's fault, the conquistadores' fault, or the fault of the Christian French and English colonizers of North America. But as I see it nowadays, Europe was also a victim of colonialism, just as the other parts of the world. Especially the simple people living in Europe, you know, the simple farmers and craftsmen. They were just as much a victim of colonialism. If you take, for example, the farmer of the 19th century in Europe, in Germany, for instance, when all these gigantic plains in North America were colonized and turned into wheat plantations, the overall price of wheat on the global market dropped significantly because, you know, the market was just flooded with wheat. And so the German farmers could not exist anymore. You know, they had significant problems. And they were as much a victim of these colonial trade networks as were the people in the colonies. Now, who were the people maintaining colonialism, pushing colonialism forward and profiting from colonialism? It was mainly trade and banking and raw material monopolies. And who were these people? I mean, if we go back to the beginning of modern colonialism, to Christopher Columbus, I didn't know, up until recently, up until 2 years ago, I didn't know who Christopher Columbus actually was, you know? I always thought he was like a Spanish guy or Italian, Genevan guy, and it was kind of a coincidence when I found out who he really was. I don't know, I was always interested in colonialism, and 2 years ago I decided to, you know, get into it a little bit again, and so I borrowed some Columbus biographies. And in one of the biographies it was hinted that Christopher Columbus might actually have been a Jewish person. And that was kind of odd. And so I checked up the sources that would indicate this. And there was one book by Salvador de Madariaga, a Spanish historian, who quite convincingly worked out that Christopher Columbus was actually a Jewish guy, a Sephardic Jew, whose family emigrated probably in the late 1300s. They probably emigrated to Italy, to Geneva. And so when he, in the late 1400s, came back from Geneva to Spain and to Portugal to become a captain, he was just coming back to his homeland or to the land of origin of his ancestors. And it was quite convincingly pointed out that the name Colombo is actually a Jewish name originating from the region of, nowadays Barcelona. One of the most striking things about this Columbus thing is that he always tried to hide his true origins, and this was quite understandable because at the time, in 1492, for example, there were huge pogroms against Jews, and they were basically expelled from Spain. And since he wanted to convince the Spanish crown to finance his expeditions, he was obviously trying to hide his origins and his true identity, so he never really talks about where he comes from, what his parents did, and so this is why historians have quite a difficult time to actually establish for certain where he actually comes from and what his origins are. And if you read this book by Madariaga, it's quite, he puts forward quite a lot of evidence, circumstantial evidence and quite hard evidence that he actually was a Sephardic Jew. And one of the most convincing arguments that I find that speaks for this hypothesis is that if you look at what he actually wrote, you can kind of trace his voyages from his logbooks, but the logbooks that he wrote himself are lost, and we only have the copies that Bartolomé de las Casas made of his logbooks. So the originals are not preserved, and we only have the copies of another monk, which are edited by the monk. It's not, they are like shortened in some passages. Not everything is in there, so we don't have the originals of what he actually wrote. But there's one thing that he authored, and it is called the Book of Prophecies, El Libro de las Profecías. And this book he wrote together with another monk from Spain, a Christian monk, which I don't remember the name right now. But together with this monk he wrote this book, and the book contains a list of passages from the Bible, mainly from certain books. I think it was so it contains passages from the Bible that would prove that with the discovery of the Western Isles, the end of the world is near. So the end of times, whatever, is near, and the prophecies will be fulfilled. And what does he want to achieve with that? He wants to prove, and this is all in the book, and there's like letters that he sent to the king, to the Queen Isabella, and to the king, and he wants to convince the king and the queen that the end times are now near, and that the prophecies will be fulfilled, and that Zion, the holy land of the Jews, will be reclaimed by the chosen people. And so by his discovery of the Western Isles, he wants to convince the queen that the prophecy is now fulfilled, that Zion will now be reclaimed by the Jewish people, or for the Jewish people. And he wants to convince the queen and the king to spearhead this movement, to be the protagonists, to lead the army that will reconquer Zion. And if this sounds outlandish for you, that Christopher Columbus wrote something like that, I advise you to look that up. Look up the Book of Prophecies by Christopher Columbus, and you will find out that Christopher Columbus was a Zionist, and that his main goal was the reconquest of Zion, and that his whole discovery in the west of the islands was probably already before he went there to discover these islands. He already probably had the plan to discover some kind of island in the west and some kind of indigenous people that then would be Christian, to fulfill the prophecy, and then to convince the queen and the king of Spain to conquer Zion, Israel, basically. there's much more to the whole colonialism debate. If you say that the Europeans, the Spanish, for example, are responsible for mass genocide in the new colonies, you know, then you have to admit that the Spanish queen and king, they never wanted to finance Columbus's expedition. Columbus spent years, probably decades, at the Spanish court trying to convince the queen and the king to finance his expedition, and they wouldn't do so. So in the end, I think I don't know who convinced the queen and the king finally to finance this expedition, but it was only through the medium of other banks. So there was some kind of bank that gave money to the king and the queen, which then was given to finance Columbus's expedition. And obviously the king and the queen had somehow had to repay this money. So, you know, the banking sector was once again basically the driving force behind colonialism, because then it was banks who wanted to get a profit and wanted to get their money back. And then the next thing, you know, was it like the Spanish people who wanted to colonize the New World? No, it wasn't, because nobody wanted to go on the ship, and this is why the whole ship is just filled with delinquents, you know, with prisoners. So the only people volunteering for this voyage were prisoners. You know, they could get a chance of being freed. The prison system would get rid of, you know, unwanted people. So yeah, just send them to the end of the world. Most of normal people didn't have any, you know, they didn't want to go. So most of the people in Europe, they were happy where they were. And you can now look at all the colonialism. You can look at all the colonies that were established in Indonesia, in India, in South Africa, everywhere, wherever you look. Colonies in the modern times start with trade expeditions, with banks, with trading, with money, and not with the will of some European people. You know, mostly the European people were also just pawns in the whole business of colonialism. If you look at the British Empire, you know, what was British about the British Empire? British were the mercenaries, the poor people gathered from all over England and pressed into colonial expeditionary forces to protect trade interests, to protect the trading posts and the trade routes that were established by banking and by trade. And who was behind banking and trade? It was international elites. It was, you know, a small group of people. It was not the European people by itself, you know. If you look at the colonization of North America, of the Great Plains, then again, we learned still in school that the Germans and French and English who went to colonize the Great Plains, they were themselves poor people, and they were lured into contracts by professional companies. They were lured into a contract where, you know, they didn't have any money by themselves. They were dead poor by themselves. But there was this company who said, look, you get the ticket on this ship for free. And when you arrive in the new lands, you just get a plot there and you work that plot. And for the first 10 years of working that plot, you will pay like 10%, 20%, 50%, I don't know. You will pay a percentage of your income back to us to repay your ticket. And this was like a big business scheme, you know. It was not the European people who wanted to go there. It was a business scheme, the colonization. And it was not really the European people who profited from all of that. And who wanted all of that. So the same applies for India, you know, and all the other colonies. In my opinion, it's not the European people. Now, there's even a black historian from the United States. His name is Tony Martin, and he was basically persecuted by the media for his lectures on Black history, where he pointed out, based on Jewish historians and Jewish encyclopedias, he pointed out that the main benefactors and the driving force behind the transatlantic slave trade were Jewish businessmen, and that like 60% of Jews in the United States possessed slaves, whereas maybe very few percent of the European immigrants, the non-Jewish immigrants, had slaves. So he pointed out that the main traders in slaves who dominated the slave trade were Jewish people, and the people who employed slaves were also mostly Jewish people. So much for the white people are the evil slavers, And there's more and 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 more about the whole topic. If you look into it, you will find out that it's not always as one-sided and simple as they make it out, as they make it look. And it's a very complex matter, and there's absolutely no reason for white people, for European people, to feel guilty about anything, because just look it up, just immerse yourself in history and draw your own conclusions.